This week on Jerusalem Dateline, Palestinian attacks intensify as Israeli Prime Minister Netanyahu pledges Israel will overcome this latest wave of violence. Plus, an in-depth look at Russia's strategic move into the Middle East and what it means for the region. Also, Christian refugees in Europe fear the wave of Muslim migrants will turn their safe haven into one more place of persecution. And Israeli archaeologists may have discovered the tombs of ancient heroes known as the Maccabees. Hello and welcome to this edition of Jerusalem Dateline. I'm Chris Mitchell, coming to you from just outside the Damascus Gate and Jerusalem's Old City. Israel is on the highest alert because of the growing violence in Jerusalem and surrounding areas. Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu has even declared the Temple Mount off limits to Israeli Knesset members. Prime Minister Netanyahu warned his country that the flames of radical Islam burning throughout the Middle East are also reaching Israel.
We're in the midst of a wave of terrorism. Terrorists that have been incited and who are riven with hate are trying to attack our people, babies, children, men and women, civilians and soldiers.
In just 2 days, Palestinians carried out multiple stabbing attacks in Jerusalem and other cities in Israel and the disputed territories, including 2 nearby here in Jerusalem's Old City. Rock throwing and firebombing cars are regular occurrences, as well as rioters clashing with Israeli soldiers. Netanyahu and other government ministers went on to live television to calm the anxiety.
Israelis are acting with bravery, composure, and determination to neutralize and eliminate the terrorists. This requires extraordinary courage.
Netanyahu blames Hamas, the Palestinian Authority, and the Islamic movement in Israel. He also said the Islamic movement is igniting the ground with lies regarding our policy on the Temple Mount. Earlier, Netanyahu declared the Temple Mount off limits to Knesset members, including Arab MKs, in an effort to calm the situation. Jerusalem Mayor Nir Barkat called on Israelis with gun permits to carry their weapons. Jerusalem schools went on strike because parents are afraid to send their children to school. Many are asking if this violence could be a third intifada. But Palestinian expert Pinkas Inbari says it doesn't matter what it's called.
They are throwing stones, they are killing, they are shooting, they are stabbing. So they are not quite. So whether it is intifada or not, it does not important.
Overall, Israel wants to deal with troublemakers and not create friction with the entire Palestinian population. Besides the wave of Palestinian violence, Israeli leaders are concerned that Vladimir Putin is increasing Russia's military presence inside Syria with tanks, warships, and more. He says he wants to fight ISIS. But is that really his plan, or does he want more? Dale Hurd has that story.
Since the beginning of Russia's military buildup in Syria, world leaders have been wondering what Vladimir Putin is really up to. Yes, Putin wants to rescue his ally, the brutal Syrian dictator Bashar al-Assad, from losing a bloody civil war. And Russia would like to hang on to its naval facility in the Syrian port of Latakia. But is that all Putin is after? Or does he have other goals as well?
We don't truly understand yet what it is that Russia is going to do in Syria.
What experts do know is that Vladimir Putin could create a lot of trouble in the Middle East. But in the process, he could also boost the ailing Russian economy, an economy that is still in the tank from low oil prices and from Western economic sanctions over Russia's annexation of Crimea. And despite Putin's efforts to diversify the economy, it still lives or dies with energy prices.
The ruble is very sensitive to the moves of oil prices. So if oil becomes cheaper, the ruble does the same.
Putin has taken a big gamble with the public at home by going into Syria. Polls show most Russians opposed sending troops to Syria. But perhaps Putin realizes that by moving into Syria, he can protect his ally Assad and gain the side benefit of rising oil prices, thus boosting the Russian economy and his standing at home. Russia's military buildup and bombing campaign in Syria have revived the so-called security premium, a small rally in oil prices based on the fear of shortages in other parts of the world because of war in the Middle East. A big escalation in fighting could mean a big escalation in oil prices. Russia is also competing with the Saudis for energy customers, and a war in the Middle East makes Saudi supplies look less reliable. And with its new airbase in Syria, Russia could coordinate with Iran to disrupt shipments from Persian Gulf and Red Sea terminals. So by unleashing his military in Syria, Vladimir Putin could kill two birds with one stone, both saving an ally and reviving Russia's oil-based economy. Dale Hurd, CBN News.
Putin's move into Syria is one of the biggest geopolitical developments in the Middle East in decades. Early this week in our Washington, D.C. studio, I sat down with Stephen Boochi. Boochi was the military attaché to former Secretary of Defense Donald Rumsfeld and now serves as the Director of Foreign Policy Studies at the Heritage Foundation. How would you characterize this move by Vladimir Putin?
It caught everybody by surprise, Chris. This was, we saw when they were starting to move some equipment in, but the amount of it, the sudden shift in them now doing air operations, caught everybody by surprise, and it is probably the most significant development in the last year.
And what do you think, what are the goals? What's the initial goal from your perspective of what Putin is trying to do?
His primary goal is to keep Bashar al-Assad in power. That's what he needs. That way he keeps his seaport there in Tartus. He now keeps the air base that they're building up as we speak. And it allows them to have the maximum influence both inside Syria and in the region. They've combined on this with Iran because they have exactly the same interests there, but theirs are even broader in maintaining the so-called Shia crescent. Secondary goals are to cause as much trouble and mischief for the United States as possible because it minimizes our influence and damages our reputation in the area. And only third does he really get at killing terrorists, which he does have an interest in doing, but that's at best the third priority.
You talked about minimizing the U.S. presence in the region. This represents a huge change. Hasn't it been the foreign policy of the United States to keep Russia out of the Middle East for decades?
For many decades, we have slowly, country by country, sort of pushed originally the Soviet Union and then Russia out of the area. They really were not relevant there other than inside Syria and for a couple of countries as an arms dealer. Now, they're the big player. Even Iraq, the country that we liberated from Saddam Hussein, has basically said, yeah, well, we're going to work with the Russians now. America, you just haven't come through for us. So if we want to fight ISIS, we have to side with the Russians to do it. That's a major shift in the political alignment.
How would you describe the Obama administration's foreign policy in the Middle East, or lack of it?
It's pretty feckless. I mean, it's impotent at best. They have done as little as possible to still be able to say they're doing something. It has had very little effect. It stopped ISIS from continuing on to Baghdad, but they were getting kind of overstretched anyway. But they haven't rolled them back at all, and that has allowed them to continue to be a magnet for recruitment of Islamist jihadists from all over the world, and clearly hasn't done anything to help, particularly inside of Syria itself.
So basically, has the Obama administration left a vacuum?
A complete vacuum, and because they were so surprised by all this, they really have had not even anything viable to say in response to what the Russians are doing, including the diplomatic and military slap in the face of a Russian colonel walking up to the American embassy in Baghdad, knocking on the door and handing them a démarche, a letter from their government to our government, saying, hey, we're starting airstrikes this morning. You guys better stay out of the way.
The FBI and a small group of Moldovan investigators have uncovered a nuclear black market in Eastern Europe. In the past 5 years, they've uncovered 4 plots to sell radioactive materials to ISIS and other terrorist groups. Heather Sells has the latest.
Investigators in Moldova arrested this man, Valentin Grosu, in a sting operation earlier this year. Grosu thought he was selling deadly cesium to the Islamic State. He offered enough to contaminate several city blocks.
Valentin
asked him from the very beginning, "Who do you represent?" Our agent said, "Man, they're hotshots. They're from the Islamic State."
Another sting operation revealed a plot by this Russian man in Moldova known as the Colonel. He tried to sell bomb-grade uranium to this man with a plan to target the U.S. Here, a middleman, Theodore Chetris, explains how it works to an undercover police informant.
They can make one of those dirty ones, you know, a dirty bomb. The level of radiation is high, and these explosions spread material over a wide territory.
Police later arrested Chetris and found evidence that he was making a separate deal to sell nuclear material to a real buyer.
During the meetings with him, Chetris said multiple times that these substances must have a real buyer from the Islamic State to make a dirty bomb, and that the American state must be annihilated.
The four sting operations underscore an emerging nuclear threat in Eastern Europe that is far from contained. After each bust, kingpins got away or avoided long prison sentences.
Until the head of the criminal group is sentenced and jailed, until we know for sure where these substances seized in Europe came from and where they are going to, then it's possible the danger is still present.
It's a danger no one in the West wants. Nuclear smugglers, some with Russian ties, selling to terrorists. For now, Moldovan authorities say they expect more of such cases as smugglers believe there is big money to be made. Heather Sells, CBN News.
Coming up, hear what some Middle East Christians who found refuge in Europe are saying about the future of the continent. Welcome back to Jerusalem Dateline. Middle East Christians fleeing militant Islam have found refuge in the West. But now with the wave of Muslim migrants into Europe, some are wondering if there's any safe place. That's what a group of Christians in Sweden told CBN News. Gary Lane has their story.
Welcome to the Swedish city of Södertälje. More than half the people here are Christian immigrants. Most have fled violence and persecution in Iraq and Syria. Many of them have come to churches like this one because they want to express themselves freely, to worship freely in the West. But even here in Sweden, they're now questioning their safety and their future. Those attending services at St. Ephraim's are members of the Syriac Orthodox Church, the world's oldest Christian community. They pray and sing in Aramaic, the ancient language of Jesus. Some of these Christians are worried about the sudden wave of new migrants and refugees entering Europe.
If this massive influx of Muslim immigrants come from North African countries and from Middle Eastern countries, they want to impose Sharia law. We are just trying to keep our traditions and our values and our democracy alive.
But as thousands pour over borders, will they assimilate and embrace Western culture, or will they attempt to impose their ways on the West? And as they did in Iraq and Syria, will these Muslim refugees extend their war to Europe? These Christians found a safe haven in Sweden, but now some fear it may eventually be lost. Amr Georges Benham worked with the Americans in Iraq. He fled his country because his life was threatened.
I was an engineer and I wanted to build my country, but they wouldn't let me. They forced me out of my country. I'm afraid these newcomers may want to destroy this peaceful country.
Some people on social media are questioning the motives of the refugees. This Hungarian police video shows male migrants tossing water onto train tracks. They said they didn't want food or water. They only wanted to get to Germany. But why? Are they seeking jobs and a better life? Or are some coming to wage war on Europe? ISIS says 4,000 of its jihadists have infiltrated the refugee ranks. And Bulgarian border guards have already arrested suspected ISIS terrorists posing as refugees. This Muslim migrant from Syria has some advice for the Swedish government.
Before letting them settle here, the Swedish government should check Facebook and use other means to determine if these refugees were fighters in Syria or Iraq.
And some Christian migrants of Södertälje believe European governments need to do more to protect them and Western culture from a potential armed or unarmed Islamic invasion.
They're trying to be nice, but it doesn't work. They should be concerned for the future generations and take their Christianity more seriously and come back to their Lord and Savior Jesus Christ.
Gary Lane, CBN News, Södertälje, Sweden.
Up next, retired General Jay Garner talks about the U.S. fight against ISIS and how to help the Kurds. Welcome back to Jerusalem Dateline. Recently, we traveled to Kurdistan and met with retired U.S. General Jay Garner, who has extensive experience in the region. He told us how U.S. policy is failing one of our most trusted allies in the region, the people of Kurdistan. What do people need to know, say in the U.S., talking to people, and what do they need to know about what's happening, especially up here in northern Iraq and the Kurdish area?
Well, what they need to know is that the only people that are successfully fighting ISIS is the Kurdish Peshmerga, and that's the Syrian Pesh, the Iraqi Pesh, the Turkish Pesh, and the Iranians not so much. You got a country here of 4.5, 5 million people that are totally pro-American, more so than we're pro-American. They're in one of the most strategic locations in the world, in the Middle East for us. To their east is our enemy Iran, to the south is our enemy Shia Iraq, to the west is our enemy Syria, and to the north is what we call a NATO ally, Turkey, which gives you great lines of communication. So you're in for a military guy, it's a military man's dream. I mean, you're at a perfect place where you could strike out of there at any of your enemies, plus you got support in the north with an ally. And so if we want them to be successful, as they have been, against ISIS, then we need to give them the equipment to do so. I mean, for God's sakes, we equipped the Iraqi army with some of the most modern equipment in the world, and they fled. They had less than around 1,000 people enter Iraq last August, and four divisions, 65,000 Iraqis fled and left their equipment on the ground. So we overnight, we made ISIS the best armed terrorist organization in the world. In fact, one of the best armed armies in the world.
What about the, right now there's been reports that the Russians are coming in to Syria in a greater way.
The Russians have a 56-year-old treaty with Syria. You know, they made it with Bashar Assad's father. And from that, they have supplied the Syrians over the years Russian equipment, and they get a warm weather port out of it. And it's their only friend in the Arab world, their only ally in the Arab world. And the Russians, Putin is not going to let that go away. So he's putting forces in there to defend Assad. And so the problem there is if he puts fighter aircraft in there and they begin to put in airstrikes against rebel forces while we're putting in airstrikes against Assad forces, how do you deconflict all that? And it's a tinderbox. I mean, it could cause some great problems between the two of us.
If you were advising or implementing U.S. policy in the region, what would you do?
The first thing I'd do in this region is to recognize that both Syria and Iraq are not going to come back together again. I mean, Iraq is going to be 3 cantons or 3 federal areas. Syria is going to be at least that much too. I mean, I think, and both of them are going to have a caliphate where ISIS is now for several years. In Syria, you'll have an Alawite section, and you'll have a Kurdish section. In Iraq, you'll have a Kurdish section and a Shia section, and the caliphate's the Sunni section. So I'd recognize that for what it is. And then I would drastically increase the measures we're taking against terrorist elements, ISIS and the offshoots of ISIS, offshoots of Al-Qaeda, that are going around now in Algeria, Morocco, Tunisia, Libya. It has to be stopped. And I would try to unite the Sunni Arabs to help me do that. I would absolutely guarantee the survival of Israel.
Israeli archaeologists may have discovered the tombs of ancient Jewish heroes, the Maccabees. Welcome back to Jerusalem Dateline. Israeli archaeologists may have discovered the tombs of ancient Jewish heroes known as the Maccabees. They say a Byzantine Christian gravesite may hold the key. CBN News Middle East correspondent Julie Stahl has that story.
There is a place of honor, of dignity to the Maccabean in Christianity. And we can conclude that ancient Christianity, like we, the archaeologists, seek the ancient tomb of the Maccabean.
While you won't find their story in the Bible, Neta냐hu the Hasmonean and his 5 sons led a revolt against Greek rulers here about 160 years before Jesus. They cleansed the Jewish temple in Jerusalem from idolatry. Hanukkah commemorates their victory. The discovery is about a mile from the modern Israeli city of Modi'in, in the area where the Maccabees would have lived.
You can see behind me there is a burial niche, and at the bottom of it there is a mosaic floor. The fact that there's a cross on a mosaic floor is not something we're used to finding.
That's because of its significance to Byzantine Christians from the 6th century AD. So why would the grave have been at this site? Archaeologist Dan Shachar explains.
The Maccabees, they removed the Greek Empire presence from what is now modern Israel, and they established an independent Jewish state, which makes it significant both to Judaism and Christianity. The actual books of the Maccabees were canonized to the Catholic Bible and the Greek Orthodox Bible, the version, not in our Jewish Bible.
Archaeologist Amit Raem suggests Byzantine Christians found the original tomb and redecorated it with the mosaic.
It will not worry me as an archaeologist to find unique cross like this here. It's a symbol, it's a clue that unique persons, figures were buried here.
Jewish historian Josephus Flavius described the tombs of the Maccabees in 2 ancient texts. He described them as tall, impressive structures made of fine stone, surrounded by columns with pyramid-like roofs.
All the circumstantial evidence, the geographic, answer the descriptions of ancient historians like Josephus Flavius. There's a lot of evidence you could see plastered all over this rock, which tells us that very possibly there was something monumental on top of it, maybe something which answers the description of pyramids on top of it.
Shachar believes once they determined the importance of this site to the Byzantines, the Jewish mystery of the whereabouts of the Maccabees' tombs may also be solved. Julie Stahl, CBN News, near Modi'in, Israel.
That's just one of the many archaeological discoveries here in Israel. Well, that's it for this edition. Remember, you can follow us throughout the week on Twitter, Facebook, and now on Periscope. And remember, because of the situation, pray for the peace of Jerusalem. I'm Chris Mitchell. We'll see you next time on Jerusalem Dateline.